I want to ask you something before I tell you how it ended. Have you ever built something so carefully, so deliberately, so precisely, that you became absolutely certain no one could take it from you? Not because you were arrogant, but because you had thought of everything, every detail, every variable, every possible failure point. You had solved for all of them, and then watched someone walk through the front door, spend 3 days studying what you'd built and walk out with the blueprints. In 1961, my brother James and I signed a document. We were sitting across a table from a man named Frank Ditmore. There were lawyers in the room, his lawyers, as it turned out. The document was 41 pages. We had read it. We believed we understood it. We didn't. What we signed that afternoon in a conference room in San Bernardino gave us a check large enough to make us feel like we had won. And it gave Frank Ditmore something that had no number on it. Something that cannot be written in a contract, because its value only becomes visible in the rear-view mirror. It gave him the right to become us. My name is Richard Calloway. In 1948, my brother James and I opened a burger stand on the side of a highway in Riverside, California. We called it Calloway Brothers Burger. By 1954, it was the most efficient fast food operation in the state of California, possibly in the country. We had invented a system, a method of preparing food so precisely and so quickly that people drove 40 minutes out of their way to watch it happen and then stayed to eat. By 1961, Frank Ditmore owned the system. By 1975, Frank Ditmore owned the world. This is what happened in between. Before we go back to where this began, where are you watching this story from today? Drop your city in the comments below. It never stops amazing me how this community keeps growing with people from so many different parts of the world. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. We tell stories like this every week. Stories about people who built something real. Stories that make you think. You'll want to be here for the next one. Let me take you back to 1948, because to understand what Frank Ditmore took, you have to understand what it cost us to build it in the first place. James and I grew up in a house where money was a conversation that happened in whispers behind closed doors. Our father worked at a cannery outside of Fresno. Our mother took in laundry. We had enough, but just enough, and always just, and the just was something you could feel in the house the way you feel a draft through a window that doesn't quite close. James was the one who loved to cook. Even as a boy, he'd stand at the stove on Saturday mornings, making things that had no business tasting as good as they did. Scrambled eggs with something in them, pancakes with a crust that no one else's pancakes had. He had an instinct for it, the way certain people have an instinct for music or mathematics. Food was his language. I was the one who loved the problem. Give me a broken thing and a set of constraints, and I would sit with it until I found the elegant solution. Not the good solution, the elegant one, the one where nothing is wasted, nothing is repeated unnecessarily, and the output is better than anyone expected from the input. Together, we were exactly what a restaurant needs and almost never has at the start. Someone who can make food people want to eat, and someone who can figure out how to make it the same way 1,000 times in a row. We opened in June of 1948 with $1,100 between us, a leased building on Route 66, just outside of Riverside, and a menu of 9 items: hamburgers, cheeseburgers, French fries, shakes, coffee. That was it. James said from the first day, fewer items, better items. I said, fewer items, faster service. We were saying the same thing in different languages, and it was, as it turned out, the correct thing to say. The thing that made Calloway Brothers Burger different from every other burger stand in California was not the food, though the food was exceptional. It was the system. I designed it over the course of about 8 months in 1949. I spent every evening after close drawing on large sheets of butcher paper, mapping every movement, every station, every handoff between the person who took the order and the person who assembled the food and the person who handed the bag to the customer. I timed everything with a stopwatch. I tested different configurations. I moved stations around the kitchen the way you move pieces on a chessboard, looking for the version where every unnecessary step was eliminated. I called it the Speedy system. James laughed at the name. He said it sounded like a children's cartoon character. I said it described exactly what it did. The principle was simple. Every person in the kitchen had exactly one job, mastered completely, performed identically every time. The person who dressed the buns did not flip the burgers. The person who ran the fryer did not touch the shake machine. Every station was positioned in the precise location that minimized travel distance between the most frequent consecutive tasks. We could produce a complete order, burger, fries, shake, in under 60 seconds. 60 seconds in 1950, when the average diner took 12 minutes. People came to watch us. That part is not an exaggeration. On weekends, families would pull off the highway and stand outside the service window just to see how we did it. James would catch me sometimes, watching the crowd watching us, and he'd shake his head and say, "Richard, we're not a restaurant, we're a circus." I'd tell him the circus was selling the most hamburgers per square foot in the state of California, and he'd stop complaining. By 1954, we were serving over 300 customers a day. We had no indoor seating. I had removed it in 1952 because the tables created inefficiency. Customers ordered at the window, received their food in paper bags and paper cups, ate in their cars or at the outdoor tables. The turnover was constant. The revenue was consistent in a way that felt almost mechanical, because it was. We had built a machine, a beautiful, precise, repeatable machine. And in the spring of 1955, Frank Ditmore drove his Cadillac into our parking lot and ordered a cheeseburger. I want to be precise about Frank, the way I've learned to be precise about everything I care about, because I have told this story to my wife, to my son, to my attorney, to a journalist who came to the house in 1972, and every time I tell it, I have to resist the temptation to make Frank Ditmore into a monster. He wasn't a monster. What he was is harder to name and harder to defend against. Frank Ditmore was a man who understood, better than almost anyone I have ever met, the difference between a thing and the idea of a thing. He came into our lives as a kitchen equipment salesman. He traveled the western states selling commercial mixers, large industrial models, the kind used in restaurants and institutional kitchens. He was 52 years old, with a wide face and very steady eyes, and the kind of handshake that communicates deliberate effort. He wore good suits that weren't quite excellent suits, and he drove a Cadillac that was 3 years old but impeccably maintained. He said he'd heard about us from a supplier in Pasadena. He said he was in the area and thought we might be interested in upgrading our shake equipment. He ordered a cheeseburger and ate it standing at one of our outdoor tables, and then spent 45 minutes asking me questions. Not the questions a salesman asks. A salesman asks about volume and budget and decision timelines. Frank asked about the system. How did we sequence the orders? How did we train new employees? How long did training take? What happened when someone didn't show up? How did we adapt the stations? Had we ever considered opening a second location? And if not, why not? I remember standing there in the afternoon sun, answering his questions and feeling something I couldn't name precisely. Not discomfort, not suspicion. Something closer to the feeling you get when someone is reading over your shoulder. Not hostile, just closer than you expected. James liked him immediately. James liked almost everyone immediately, which was one of his gifts and also, as it turned out, one of the ways we became vulnerable. Frank came back the following Tuesday. He hadn't sold us any equipment. He knew he wasn't going to sell us equipment. He came back because he wanted to see the lunch rush. He stood off to the side of the parking lot with a cup of coffee and watched us run 300 orders in 4 hours. I saw him glance at his watch twice. I didn't understand what he was measuring. I understand now. Have you ever had the experience of being studied by someone who was so skilled at appearing to be merely curious that you didn't recognize the study until it was complete? That's a particular kind of intelligence. The ability to ask questions that feel like conversation but are actually reconnaissance. Frank Ditmore had that intelligence in abundance. He came back 4 more times over the next 3 months. Each time he brought something, a new piece of equipment he thought we should look at, a trade publication with an article he'd marked, a bag of malted milk powder from a supplier he claimed made better shakes, small offerings, reasons to return that weren't actually the reason he was returning. I remember exactly where I was standing, behind the counter, reviewing our supply order for the week. James was in the kitchen. Frank was leaning against the service window frame, holding his coffee, and he used the word like he was trying it on, lightly, casually. The way you mention something you've been thinking about for months while pretending it just occurred to you. Licensing, he said. Have you boys ever thought about what it would mean if other people could run a Calloway Brothers burger? If you could take this system, because that's what it is, Richard, it's a system, it's transferable, and put it in 20 cities, 100 cities. I told him we'd thought about it. We had, actually. James and I had talked about a second location, possibly a third. But we'd always come back to the same problem. We couldn't be in 2 places at once, and the system only worked because we were there to maintain it. Frank nodded like I'd said something very interesting. He said, "What if you didn't have to be there?" That question, that specific question, is the one I have turned over in my mind for the past 30 years. Not because it was wrong. It wasn't wrong. It was exactly the right question. The problem was that Frank already knew the answer, and we didn't know that he knew, and the difference between his knowledge and our ignorance was the entire margin by which he won. Frank Ditmore proposed what he called a franchise development partnership in the spring of 1956. He would handle the business development side, finding locations, vetting potential franchisee operators, managing the relationships with suppliers and real estate, while James and I would license the Calloway Brothers name, the menu, and critically, the Speedy system. We would receive a percentage of every franchise location's revenue. Frank would receive a development fee and his own percentage for his work building the network. It sounded, on the surface, like the thing we had been unable to do ourselves. We had the product, we had the system. What we didn't have was the capital, the contacts, or the disposition to spend our time driving around California convincing strangers to open burger stands. Frank had all 3. Dorothy read the agreement before we signed it. She sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours with the document and a cup of tea and came to me afterward with 2 pages of notes in her handwriting. She said the revenue percentages were lower than they should be. She said the clause about the real estate was unusual. Frank had proposed that the franchise development company would own the land under each location, not the franchisee and not us. She said the termination language was vague in ways that worried her. I told her that Frank had explained all of those points. I told her the real estate structure was standard for this kind of arrangement. I told her the termination language would be cleaned up before signing. The termination language was not cleaned up before signing. I have looked at that original document many times in the years since. The language is exactly what Dorothy flagged. Vague in the specific way that benefits one party and not the other. The party it did not benefit was us. We signed on a Thursday afternoon in April of 1956. James shook Frank's hand for a long time afterward, the way James shook hands when he was genuinely happy. I remember feeling something I told myself was excitement. I know now it was the particular alertness of a body that senses something the mind has not yet admitted. The first 2 years of the partnership were, by every measurable standard, successful. Frank opened 11 franchise locations across California and Arizona. Each one used the Speedy system. Each one served our menu. Each one bore the Calloway brothers' name in red letters on the sign above the service window. James and I drove to visit the first 3. We stood in the parking lots and watched the operations and felt something I can only describe as the particular pride of seeing an idea travel beyond you, of watching something you made in one place exist, intact, somewhere you'd never been. James cried a little at the second one. He tried to pretend he hadn't. I didn't say anything. What we did not see, because we were not watching for it, was what Frank was doing in the margins of those visits. He was buying the land. Every location Frank opened, and this is the thing that I did not understand until our attorney explained it to us in 1960, was built on land that Frank's development company had purchased or leased in its own name. Not in the name of the franchise operator, not in our name, in Frank's company's name. Which meant that the revenue a franchise location generated from hamburgers and French fries was only part of what it generated. The other part was rent. Every operator paid rent to Frank's company for the land under their restaurant, every month, in perpetuity. The burger business was good. The real estate business was a different category of good entirely, and we had signed an agreement that gave Frank the right to build it using our name. What would you have done if you had discovered this, I ask, because I've thought about it every year since 1960, and I still cannot tell you with certainty that I would have done something different than what we did. We confronted Frank. He was calm. He was always calm. And he said that the real estate arrangement was disclosed in the agreement, which was technically true in the way that many catastrophic things are technically true in contracts. It was disclosed in a subordinate clause on page 27, in language that described it as a standard development structure. He said it created alignment of incentives. He said it made him work harder to make each location succeed because he had a financial stake in the real estate. He was not wrong about any of that, and he was not wrong in the legal sense. And I have spent 3 decades understanding that not wrong in the legal sense is one of the most dangerous phrases in the English language. There is a specific moment, not a dramatic one, not a confrontation or a document or a betrayal you can point to cleanly, when you realize that something you built has started to belong to the person who is running it rather than to the person who made it. For me, that moment came in the fall of 1958. I was visiting a franchise location in San Diego, the 4th one Frank had opened, a good operation, well run. I walked through the kitchen to check the station layout and found that 2 of the stations had been repositioned, not dramatically, a few feet each, but enough to break the sequence I had designed, the precise sequence where each movement flowed into the next without backtracking. I asked the manager why the stations had been moved. He said Frank had recommended the change during his last visit, said it improved traffic flow. It didn't improve traffic flow. It was marginally less efficient than the original design, which I could demonstrate with a stopwatch in 20 minutes. But that wasn't the thing that stayed with me. The thing that stayed with me was this. Frank had walked into a kitchen that was mine, built on a system I had designed and refined over 9 years, and moved the furniture. And no one had called me. I drove home to Riverside that evening, and I told Dorothy what had happened. She listened without interrupting, which was her way when she knew the thing I was saying was more serious than I was letting on. When I finished, she said very quietly, "Richard, how many of those kitchens have you visited in the past year?" I said 4. She said, "And how many has Frank visited?" I didn't know the answer. That was the answer. James and I began disagreeing around this time. Not openly, not with anger, but in the way that two people who trust each other begin to diverge when they are looking at the same situation and seeing different things. James saw the growth. The numbers were extraordinary. By 1959, the franchise network had grown to 37 locations. Revenue from our licensing percentage was more than we had ever imagined earning from a single restaurant. James would spread the quarterly statements across the kitchen table and trace the numbers with his finger the way he used to trace a new recipe he was excited about. He said we were becoming something historic. He said Frank was doing what we never could have done alone. I didn't disagree with any of that. What I said, and this is the part James couldn't fully hear, was that becoming something historic and remaining in control of what you'd become were two different things. And the distance between them was growing. Frank was the one the franchise operators called when they had a problem. Frank was the one the suppliers negotiated with. Frank was the one who showed up at the opening of each new location, who gave the remarks, who shook the local mayor's hand in front of the photographer. Our name was on the sign. Frank's face was in the newspaper. I started keeping a file around this time. Notes from my visits, photographs of kitchen layouts, records of conversations. James thought I was being paranoid. Dorothy thought I wasn't being paranoid enough. She was right. She was almost always right. I only understood that completely later, and later is when understanding costs the most. Frank came to Riverside in February of 1961. He drove up on a Tuesday morning unannounced, which was unusual. Frank was a man who scheduled things. The fact that he arrived without a prior conversation should have told me something. Everything that happened that day should have told me something, if I had been listening to the right signals instead of the ones I wanted to hear. He sat down at the table in our back office and he put a number on it, not a piece of paper, just a number. He said it out loud, quietly, with no particular emphasis, the way someone states a fact they have already decided is true. He offered to buy us out. The name, the system, all rights to the Calloway Brothers brand, for a sum that was, by any measure, more money than James and I had ever expected to see in our lives. He said we would each receive a check. He said we would retain the right to operate our original Riverside location, the one we'd built in 1948, as a private business. He said the transition could be completed within 90 days. James looked at me across the table. I looked at James. There was a long silence. I said I needed time to think about it. Frank said, of course. He said there was no rush. He drove back to San Bernardino, and James and I sat in that back office for 2 hours without saying very much. The kind of silence that happens when two people are thinking about the same thing from completely different angles, and both of them know it. That evening I spread everything across the kitchen table. The original partnership agreement, the quarterly statements, the file I'd been keeping for 2 years. Dorothy sat across from me with her reading glasses on and went through it all while I made coffee and then drank the coffee and then made more. After about an hour, she took off her glasses and looked at me and said, "You already know what you want to do." That was the most important thing anyone said to me during that entire period. I didn't fully understand it until I'd spent 18 months and a significant amount of our savings trying to answer the question she was asking. We did not accept Frank's offer in February of 1961. I want to be clear about that because the narrative of what happened to us tends to collapse into the moment of the final signing and the months in between, the months where we fought, where we were not passive, where we made Frank work for what he eventually got. Those months matter. We hired an attorney. A man named Gerald Hook, who practiced commercial law in Los Angeles and who had the useful quality of being genuinely angry on behalf of his clients when the facts warranted it. The facts warranted it. Gerald spent 3 weeks going through every document we'd signed with Frank since 1956. He came back to us with a legal pad full of notes and a specific expression I had not seen on an attorney's face before. Something between admiration and alarm. He said Frank's agreement was the most carefully constructed piece of legal architecture he'd encountered in 20 years of practice. He said almost every clause that disadvantaged us was technically disclosed and technically legal. He said the real estate structure in particular had been designed by someone who knew exactly what they were building before they built it. But he also said there was something. In the original 1956 partnership agreement on page 11, there was a clause that required Frank's development company to use the Calloway brothers' name only in conjunction with the original Calloway brothers menu, the specific 9-item menu we had operated with since 1948. Any deviation from the menu required written approval from both Calloway brothers. Gerald had visited 6 of the franchise locations over the course of his review. At 4 of them, the menu included items that were not on the original 9-item list. A fish sandwich at the San Diego location, a hot apple dessert at the Tucson location, 2 new shake flavors at both Phoenix locations. Frank had not requested our written approval for any of these items. Individually, these were small violations. Together, they represented a pattern of Frank treating the Calloway brothers system as something he already owned rather than something he was licensed to use. Gerald said this pattern, documented carefully and presented in the right forum, gave us meaningful leverage. Not enough to unwind the entire arrangement, but enough to sit back down across the table from Frank Ditmore with something he did not expect us to have. I had kept records for 2 years. I had photographs of kitchen configurations. I had my notes from visits. I had the file I'd been building while James told me I was being paranoid. Every one of those records was now evidence of something. James, when Gerald explained all of this, sat very still for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, "You knew." I said I didn't know. I said I'd felt something and I'd been careful because I felt it. He nodded slowly. He said, "I should have listened to you." I told him I should have listened to Dorothy. We sat with that for a moment. Then James said, "So what do we do?" Gerald said we go back to Frank with a counter-proposal, and we go back informed. The second meeting happened in April of 1961. This time we chose the location, a conference room at Gerald's office in Los Angeles, not Frank's city, not our city. Neutral ground, but on our attorney's territory. Frank came with 2 lawyers. We had Gerald. The arithmetic of the room already told a story. Gerald placed a folder on the table before anyone had settled into their seats. He didn't open it immediately. He let it sit there. Frank looked at it once, and then looked at the wall, and I understood that he already knew in general terms what the folder contained. Frank always knew in general terms what was coming. That was his gift, and on this occasion, the thing that made him careful rather than dismissive. Gerald opened the folder and went through the menu deviations, each one documented, each one dated, each one cross-referenced with the clause on page 11 of the original agreement. He was methodical about it, no drama. Just the sequence of facts, laid out in the order that made their meaning clearest. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Frank said, "What is it you gentlemen are proposing?" Gerald said we were proposing a revised buyout agreement. The original number Frank had offered would remain. We were not asking for more money. What we were asking for was different. We asked for 4 things. First, The right to continue operating our original Riverside location free of any royalty or licensing obligation in perpetuity, using the Calloway brothers' name for that single location only. Second, a written acknowledgement signed by Frank Ditmore personally and incorporated into the public record of the transaction that the Calloway brothers' burger concept, the menu, the system, the operational methodology, was originated and developed by Richard and James Calloway beginning in 1948. Third, a formal naming of the Speedy system in all future documentation as the Calloway Speedy system, our name, permanently attached to the thing we built. Fourth, a charitable contribution made in our names to the Riverside Community Fund that had supported our family when we were starting out. Frank looked at the 4 points for a long time. He looked at his lawyers. He looked at us. Then he said, "The money stays the same." Gerald said yes. Frank picked up his pen. He signed. All 41 pages of the revised agreement. His lawyers signed where their signatures were required. James and I signed last. When it was done, Frank stood up and extended his hand to me. I shook it. His grip was exactly what it had always been, deliberate, measured, communicating effort. I looked at him across the handshake and thought about the first afternoon he'd stood at our service window asking questions about the system, about the 6 visits before the word licensing, about Dorothy's 2 pages of notes that I had not listened to carefully enough. I shook his hand. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say that the documents hadn't already said better. Frank Ditmore built an empire. I won't pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would dishonor the truth of what happened, and I have spent enough of my life in proximity to dishonesty to have developed a real intolerance for it. Within 10 years of our signing, the brand had expanded to over 500 locations across 28 states. Within 20 years, it was international. The name Calloway Brothers Burger appeared on buildings in 7 countries. The Calloway Speedy system, our name on our system, as the agreement required, was written about in business textbooks and management journals as a foundational innovation in the history of the fast food industry. Frank was on the cover of a business magazine in 1968. James and I read the profile at our kitchen table in Riverside. They mentioned the Calloway brothers in the 4th paragraph in a sentence that described us as the original operators whose concept Ditmore had the vision to scale. James read that sentence 3 times and then folded the magazine and put it in the recycling bin without saying anything. I took it back out later. I still have it somewhere. We kept the original restaurant. That was the first thing we'd asked for, and it was the thing I cared about most, more than the money, and in some ways more than the written acknowledgement. The building on Route 66 that we'd opened in 1948, with $1,100 and a 9-item menu and a system drawn on butcher paper. We ran it together until 1979, when James's health began to decline. I ran it alone after that, with James coming in on mornings when he felt well enough to stand at the griddle, which was most mornings right up until the end. The Speedy system was intact. Every station in the position I had designed, every sequence preserved. The menu had 9 items. It had always had 9 items. People came in sometimes who'd driven 40 minutes to eat there specifically because of what it was, the original. Where it had started. They'd heard the story, or read about it, or their parents had brought them as children, and now they were bringing their own children. There was something in that, something I didn't have a clean word for, but felt every time I watched a family at the outdoor tables eating paper bag food on a Saturday afternoon. It wasn't the empire, but it was ours. Completely, legally, permanently ours. And there is a quality to ownership that no valuation can fully capture, the quality of knowing that nothing in the document can be used against you, that the ground under your feet belongs to you alone. We had that. Frank had the rest. I made peace with that division a long time ago, though peace is a complicated word for something that still shows up in dreams occasionally. My son asked me once, when he was old enough to understand the full shape of the story, whether I was angry at Frank. He's a pragmatic person, my son. He wanted to know if I felt wronged, and if so, how I'd processed it, the way his generation asks about processing things. I told him the honest answer, which is this: Frank Ditmore didn't take anything from us that we didn't make available to him. That's not an absolution of what he did. What he did was calculated and deliberate and structured to benefit him at our expense, and I won't retroactively call it something neutral, but the architecture of what he built was built from materials we supplied. We let him into the kitchen. We answered his questions. We signed the agreement that Dorothy flagged. We visited 4 locations in the first 2 years, while Frank visited all 37. We built a system so good that someone else could run it without us, which was the achievement we were proudest of and the mechanism of our own displacement. If you are building something, I want you to hear this carefully. The quality that makes your creation valuable is the same quality that makes it transferable. The more replicable, the more systematized, the more elegantly documented your process, the more someone else can learn it, use it, and eventually claim it. Document everything. Protect your name. Understand every clause of every agreement before you sign. And when someone who is very good at asking questions spends 45 minutes asking you about your system, ask yourself why. The second thing I want you to hear is this: we got something back, not the empire. We were never getting the empire, but we got the acknowledgement. We got the name on the system. We got the original restaurant, which we ran for 31 years on our own terms and which my son now operates, still with the 9-item menu, still with the speedy system, still in the building on Route 66. Last fall, a man came in with his 2 granddaughters. He said he'd eaten at a Calloway Brothers burger in Phoenix in 1963, when he was 12 years old, and had never forgotten the food. He'd driven 3 hours to bring the girls to the original. He stood at the service window and looked at the menu board for a long time, and then he looked at me. I was behind the counter, the way I always am on Saturday mornings, and he said, "Are you one of the Calloways?" I said I was. He nodded slowly. He said, "You should know that what you built changed everything." I thanked him. He ordered 2 cheeseburgers and a shake for each of the girls, and they ate at the outdoor tables in the afternoon sun, the same tables that have been there since 1952. Frank Ditmore built an empire. We built the thing the empire was built from. I used to know which of those I'd rather have done. Lately, I'm less certain. And I think that uncertainty, that honest, unresolved uncertainty, is probably the closest thing to wisdom I've accumulated in 81 years. James would have said something better than that. He always did.